The applause began before my name disappeared. It rolled through the glass auditorium like a controlled explosion, polished and expensive, the kind of sound that meant money had already made its decision. I stood in the second row with my hands folded behind my back, watching my life's work rotate slowly across a 40-foot LED screen. The system responded perfectly, just as it always had. Smooth, precise, obedient. "Ladies and gentlemen," my father said into the microphone, his voice warm and rehearsed, engineered to inspire confidence. "What you are witnessing today is the future of autonomous financial security." He paused, letting the silence mature. Silence was his favorite tool. "And the sole visionary behind this architecture is my son, Adrian." The room erupted. Executives stood. Investors smiled. Cameras flashed. Adrian rose from his seat, adjusting a suit I had paid for, waving modestly like a man who had just solved a problem he didn't understand. I stayed where I was, frozen, as if my body refused to acknowledge what my ears had heard. My father leaned toward me without breaking his smile. "Don't make this ugly, Elias," he whispered, his breath calm, controlled. "You're the engineer. Engineers are replaceable. Smile, or you'll walk out with nothing." 10 years of my life collapsed into that sentence. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I reached into my jacket, pulled out my access badge, and placed it gently on the oak table beside me. It made a soft sound, the kind no one notices until it's too late. Then I turned and walked away. I passed investors who had shaken my hand for years without ever learning my name. I passed champagne towers celebrating a system that would not survive the night. I passed biometric scanners, redundancy protocols, and security layers humming quietly, unaware they had just lost the only person who truly spoke their language. Outside, the city swallowed me in noise and light, indifferent to what had just ended. I sat in my car in the underground garage, an old sedan with a cracked dashboard and an engine that only started because I understood how to coax it awake. The applause above me still vibrated faintly through layers of concrete, a dull, mocking heartbeat. My name is Elias Cole. I am 34 years old, and for the last decade, I have been invisible by design. Inside that building, they were celebrating a platform that processed trillions of dollars every day, a system regulators described as too stable to fail. They spoke about vision, leadership, innovation. They did not know that every compliance rule, every emergency failsafe, every defensive line of code carried my fingerprint. My brother Adrian couldn't build any of it. He couldn't even maintain it. He was a gambler who treated corporate accounts the same way he treated casino tables, always chasing the next risk. I spent my 20s cleaning his disasters, fixing breaches he didn't understand, stabilizing algorithms that could have collapsed markets if they slipped by a decimal point. I signed regulatory attestations because Adrian didn't have the credentials. I held licenses he could never earn. I stayed awake through nights and weekends, not because I was thanked, but because the system would have killed itself without me. People thought Adrian was the statue. I was the pedestal. And pedestals aren't meant to move. When I was 12, I built my first encryption model and ran home holding it like proof that I mattered. My father barely glanced at it. He pointed instead to Adrian, who was crying over a broken watch. "Fix it," he said. "Your brother shines. You support. That's how this family works." That lesson never changed. It only scaled. They taught me that love was conditional, that worth was functional, that my value existed only when I was useful. At exactly 5 o'clock every evening, my phone vibrated. The same alert. Every day. Authorization required. Level 7 override. I had pressed that confirmation thousands of times, on holidays, during funerals, in hospital corridors, because that biometric handshake was the leash keeping a trillion-dollar system compliant, legal, alive. My father thought taking my badge stripped me of power. He forgot that he hadn't built a company. He had built a regulated kingdom, and every kingdom requires a licensed monarch. I propped my tablet on the steering wheel and watched the live stream continue. My father laughed on stage. Adrian gestured confidently at features he couldn't explain. The system responded flawlessly, loyal to the hand that had trained it. My phone vibrated again. 5 p.m. The prompt appeared, clean and indifferent. Biometric authorization required to maintain compliance. The green option meant peace, silence, and going home to wait for gratitude that would never come. The red option meant collapse. I pressed decline. The system did not stutter. It did not fail dramatically. It did exactly what it had been designed to do when left unsupervised. On the live stream, the demonstration froze mid-execution. A soft alarm began to echo through the auditorium, regulatory and mandatory. My father tapped the microphone, smiling too tightly. Adrian slapped the console like it owed him something. Then the banner appeared behind them, clear and merciless. System locked, license supervisor absent. Operation suspended by law. The applause never returned. I leaned back in my seat and let the silence settle. The mechanic had stopped fixing the engine, and gravity was about to take care of the rest. The silence in my car felt heavier than the applause ever had. I watched the live stream as confusion spread across the auditorium like a slow infection. Investors leaned toward one another, whispering, their confidence evaporating in real time. My father's smile cracked, just for a second, the way glass fractures before it shatters. Adrian kept tapping the console, his movements frantic now, like a man shaking a locked door and hoping it might open out of fear. My phone rang. I had assigned my father a siren tone years ago, not out of spite, but accuracy. The sound cut through the stillness. I answered without greeting him. His voice exploded through the speaker, sharp and unfiltered, stripped of the charm he used for rooms full of money. He demanded I turn it back on, accused me of sabotage, swore I had crossed a line I would never be able to step back over. I listened calmly, my eyes fixed on the frozen image of the system on my tablet. When he paused to breathe, I spoke. I told him I hadn't sabotaged anything. I reminded him that I was just the engineer. And since I no longer worked there, I no longer had the authority to approve safety protocols. What he was witnessing wasn't revenge. It was compliance. That word enraged him. He shouted about lawsuits, about police, about ruining me so thoroughly I'd never work again. Then my mother took the phone. Her voice came out soft and trembling, the tone she used when she wanted obedience dressed up as love. She asked how I could do this to my brother, how I could humiliate the family on his biggest night. She didn't mention my firing. She didn't mention the theft. She spoke only of embarrassment, of appearances, of how much Adrian needed this moment. I realized then that, to them, my existence had always been secondary to the performance. I told her quietly that I hadn't destroyed the family. I told her they had done that themselves when they decided my life's work belonged to someone else. The line went dead for a second, then my father's voice returned, colder now, controlled, dangerous. He demanded the override code. He promised consequences if I refused. I told him there was no code. The system used biometric authorization tied to a licensed supervisor's vascular signature.
Mine.
Then he ordered me to come back and unlock it. I reminded him, calmly, that he had fired me. Mechanics, after all, don't get equity. When I ended the call, the siren stopped, but the chaos on the screen grew louder. One of the lead investors stood up. Then another. My father grabbed one of them by the arm, speaking urgently, the performance gone. I put the car into gear. I wasn't running. I was returning. The security guard in the lobby avoided my eyes as he buzzed me through. He knew. Everyone always knew. The elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than it ever had. When the doors opened, I expected lawyers, negotiations, a number large enough to buy my silence. What I found instead was stillness. The boardroom was full, but no one was speaking. Adrian leaned against the wall, scrolling through his phone. Bored already. My father stood at the head of the table, adjusting his cufflinks, unnervingly calm. I told them I was ready to discuss the equity I had been denied. My father looked at me with practiced sadness, the kind that almost convinces you it's real.
He said he was sorry.
He said he never wanted it to end this way. Before I could respond, the side doors burst open. 4 men in jackets marked FBI moved with sharp, rehearsed efficiency. The room seemed to shrink around me. An agent crossed the floor in seconds and ordered me to put my hands where he could see them. They accused me of corporate espionage, wire fraud, and deploying malicious ransomware. I felt my wrists pulled behind my back as cold metal closed around them. I looked at my father, searching his face for a flicker of humanity. He was shaking his head, playing the role of the devastated parent, holding up a folder thick with lies. He told them I had rigged the system, planted a virus, demanded half the company to release it. He called it extortion. The cuffs clicked louder than any applause ever had. Adrian pushed himself off the wall and leaned in close enough for me to smell the alcohol on his breath. He smiled and whispered that I should enjoy prison. My mother stared at the floor, silent now, unwilling to witness the monster she had helped create. As the agents led me toward the door, I realized they had planned this. When they couldn't beat me technically, they chose to bury me legally. They turned my own safeguards into a weapon. But as I passed the frozen screens, still flashing their compliance warnings, I saw something my father hadn't accounted for. The law he thought he could bend was the same law that would expose him. He believed arresting me ended the story. He didn't understand that by putting me in handcuffs, he had just stepped into a trap built entirely out of truth. They sat me in a gray room that smelled like disinfectant and old paper, the kind of place where time stops cooperating. The agent read me my rights, while another slid a recorder across the table, already convinced he knew how the story ended. To them, I wasn't an engineer or an architect. I was a bitter former employee who had tried to ransom a company and failed. I answered their questions calmly, the same way I answered every system failure for the last 10 years. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I told them exactly what I had done, and more importantly, what I hadn't. I explained that there was no virus.
No malware. No backdoor.
What they were calling sabotage was a federally mandated safety protocol for regulated financial infrastructure. I told them the system required continuous biometric authorization from a licensed compliance officer. Without it, the platform was legally obligated to enter lockdown to prevent market manipulation and consumer harm. They listened, but I could see the skepticism. Corporate crimes always sound cleaner in theory than they do in headlines. Hours passed. Somewhere above us, my father was still performing, still telling anyone who would listen that he had been betrayed by his own son. Adrian was probably already rehearsing his victim's story. The agents left the room, returned, asked the same questions again, hoping my answers would change. They didn't. Truth doesn't need revision. Then the dynamic shifted. One of the agents came back and holding a tablet, his expression no longer bored. A senior agent followed, older, slower, the kind of man who had learned to respect paperwork more than anger. He asked me about a specific error code that had appeared during the shutdown. I told him exactly what it referenced. He asked where it was defined. I told him which federal registry to check. He left without another word. When he returned, he didn't sit down. The compliance logs told a very different story than my father's affidavit. The so-called ransom demand didn't exist. What did exist was a decade of signed safety audits under my license and a trail of unauthorized overrides executed by an account tied to Adrian's credentials. Limits raised without approval. Risk thresholds bypassed to inflate performance metrics. Data altered to impress investors. The platform hadn't been sabotaged. It had been abused. The agents excused themselves again. I sat alone, hands still cuffed, staring at the reflection of a man who had finally stopped holding the world together for people who didn't deserve it. When they came back, the cuffs came off. Quietly. Without ceremony. No apology, but none was needed. They escorted me back upstairs. The boardroom felt different now. Smaller. Fragile. The investors were standing instead of sitting, their conversations sharp and urgent. My father's confidence had evaporated, replaced by a tight, desperate stillness. One of the agents spoke plainly. Removing the only licensed compliance supervisor had shut the operation down by law. Continuing to operate without one wasn't just illegal. It was criminal. Then they opened the logs. Line by line, override by override, the truth unfolded in a language money couldn't rewrite. Adrian had been falsifying data. My father had signed off on it. The investment had been built on a lie. The room turned on them with terrifying speed. Accusations flew. Phones came out. Lawyers stopped smiling. My father tried to speak. No one listened. When the cuffs went back on, they weren't for me. I watched as my brother's face collapsed into something small and afraid. I watched my father finally understand that power borrowed from someone else vanishes the moment it's recalled. As they were led away, he looked at me once, searching for mercy he had never shown. I gave him nothing. 3 months later, the company no longer existed. Its assets were seized, its name erased, its story reduced to a cautionary footnote. Adrian took a plea deal. My mother called, cried, asked for help. I didn't answer. I bought back the servers at auction, the same machines I had once kept alive for free. I walked into a new office under my own name, my own license, my own rules. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent as ever. Some systems don't deserve to be saved. Sometimes the most powerful thing a mechanic can do is step away, let the engine fail, and build something that never needed a pedestal in the first place. I stepped into my new office and felt the weight lift slowly, like a door that had been latched shut for years finally swinging open. The sunlight fell across the server racks I had reclaimed, illuminating the fingerprints of the work I had done a decade ago. The same code, the same systems, the same principles that had kept billions secure. But this time, there was no pedestal to hide behind, no statue to elevate, no family to manipulate my loyalty. The kingdom was mine to rebuild, entirely on my own terms. The first few weeks were quiet, almost suspiciously so. There were no press releases, no congratulatory calls, no investors waiting to see if I could survive without their applause. That was fine. Silence suited me. I spent the days configuring systems, rewriting code, optimizing protocols, and ensuring that every layer of protection, every algorithm, every failsafe was mine alone. This time, no one could override me. No one could claim credit for work that wasn't theirs. Every line I wrote was a statement. I existed. I mattered. And I would never again allow my life's work to be co-opted by those who valued me only when convenient. But rebuilding wasn't enough. I had to ensure that the lessons from the past were embedded into the system itself. Every safeguard, every biometric requirement, every emergency lockdown protocol I had once used to protect against mistakes and negligence now became a permanent feature. If someone tried to bypass the rules, the system would remind them that competence and accountability were not optional. They would learn, the hard way, what I had learned the hard way. Power isn't inherited or stolen, it's earned and maintained. There were moments when I still thought about the auditorium, about the applause that had never been mine, about my father and Adrian. I pictured their faces frozen, the panic spreading as the system I had built refused to obey them. I didn't feel triumph in a conventional sense, not joy, not satisfaction. I felt something quieter, sharper, vindication. Justice had been served, not through violence, not through shouting, but through precision, intelligence, and the inescapable logic of systems and law. One morning, a potential client came to visit, a large financial firm interested in our new platform. They had heard whispers about the collapse of the old company, the mysterious engineer who had outsmarted everyone, and they wanted to see the work for themselves. I led them through the servers, the clean architecture, the redundancy measures, the security layers, every aspect of a system built not for applause but for permanence. Their eyes widened when they saw the logs, the compliance protocols, the autonomy of the system. When I finished the demonstration, they didn't ask who had done it. They asked if I could guarantee that it would never fail again. I smiled, just a fraction, and said, "It already has." The workdays stretched long. I spent nights alone in the office, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I wanted to understand every fault, every variable, every tiny vulnerability that could have been exploited before. I wanted to create a system that was unassailable, not for ego, not for revenge, but because I had finally understood what it meant to be in control without being used. Eventually, my father called. He tried his old tactics: charm, guilt, desperation. I listened without interruption. He offered apologies, explanations, promises that had no weight. He tried to reinsert himself into my life, to reclaim access to what he had once tried to steal. I let the call end without a word. There was nothing to negotiate, no reconciliation necessary. The past was gone. The system I had built was mine. My name, my license, my future, they were unassailable. And in that quiet, sunlit office, I realized the truth I had learned too late the first time. The only way to protect what matters is to control it entirely, to place trust in no one who has ever been proven unworthy. I had been the pedestal for a decade, invisible and replaceable, but now I was the architect of my own world. The kingdom I had saved for others was finally my own. Sometimes, the only way forward isn't to fight the wrong system but to step away, let it collapse, and build something better from its ashes. And I had finally done exactly that. The morning I unlocked the final servers for my new company, the city felt different. Cold air moved through the streets, as if carrying the remnants of the old world, an empire built on lies, privilege, and borrowed authority. I didn't feel satisfaction in the way the movies promised. There was no champagne, no applause, no public recognition. There was only the steady hum of the servers, a quiet affirmation that the work I had done for 10 years, unseen and uncredited, had survived. I had survived. And this time, it was mine entirely. News of the old company's collapse had spread fast. Investors had lost billions. Regulators had begun audits, uncovering Adrian's falsified reports, my father's signature on fraudulent logs, the systemic negligence that had allowed corruption to fester. They had relied on appearances, on charm, on my silence, and that had been their fatal mistake. Every lie, every shortcut, every act of greed was now exposed under the relentless lens of law and logic. The people who once applauded, who once clinked glasses to celebrate a vision they didn't understand, now watched their empire crumble. I walked through my new office, servers humming, lights reflecting off the glass walls, and I understood something profound. Power isn't inherited. Power isn't claimed by bravado. Power is earned through understanding, persistence, and the courage to step away when your labor is exploited. My father had built his confidence on my invisible hands. Adrian had built his identity on my mistakes cleaned up. The collapse of their empire didn't feel like revenge. It felt inevitable. Investors called me. They came in small groups at first, then larger delegations. They wanted security, accountability, a system that worked not because someone pretended to, but because it actually did. I gave them exactly that. The moment they realized the full depth of my work, the full scope of my oversight, the same calm authority I had carried quietly for a decade, they trusted me without hesitation. For the first time, I wasn't just the mechanic. I wasn't the pedestal. I was the architect. Sometimes, the past demanded confrontation. My father attempted one last maneuver, a meeting requested under the guise of reconciliation. I agreed, not out of fear or courtesy, but to see how far he would go to cling to power that had never truly belonged to him. He arrived with Adrian and my mother in tow, the trio dressed as though their authority could still impress. They spoke, predictably, with charm and guilt layered over desperation. I listened. I did not react. I watched their faces, their shifting eyes, their body language betraying the hollow confidence they had relied upon for years. Then I showed them the evidence. Every override, every falsified log, every single misstep Adrian had taken under my license. The chain of negligence, manipulation, and fraud was undeniable. Investors, regulators, and even casual observers gasped at the clarity. My father's voice faltered, his carefully rehearsed excuses evaporating under the weight of incontrovertible truth. Adrian looked smaller than I had ever seen him, a man stripped of all pretense, exposed as incompetent. My mother's tears came too late. They were for show, for her own comfort, not for justice. The final act was simple, almost poetic. The regulatory authorities sealed the company. Adrian faced prison. My father faced civil and criminal penalties. My mother vanished into obscurity, and I was left standing with the servers humming softly, the only constant in a world that had tried to rewrite my story. I did not gloat. I did not celebrate. I simply began building. Every line of code, every system protocol, every decision was mine. I would create a company that could never be manipulated by lies or charm. A system that would serve its purpose without needing to see who got the credit. Outside, sunlight hit the office windows. The city moved on, indifferent and relentless. I stepped to the balcony, feeling the wind on my face. For the first time in a decade, I was free. Free from pedestals, free from statues, free from the invisible chains that had bound me to their convenience. I understood fully now. The only way to protect something worth saving is to control it entirely. The old world, the corrupt empire built on my labor, had collapsed. And from its ashes, I would build something new, something unbreakable, something truly mine. I leaned against the railing, watching the horizon. A calm settled over me, the kind of quiet that only comes when every injustice has been accounted for, every debt paid in full, and every lie exposed. I whispered to myself, almost inaudibly, some systems aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to fail. And some people aren't meant to be obeyed. They're meant to be outgrown. The servers hummed behind me, the city pulsed below, and I knew that for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be.